Welcome back, friends. Dan Vega here, and today we're going to be talking about Java Template Engine in Spring Boot. We've been talking about it lately. It's been added to the Spring Initializer. If you want to see some of the previous videos I've done at, I will leave them in the description below. But today I want to talk about working with forms. One of the comments I got was, hey, it was extremely easy to work with Thymeleaf and forms because we were able to bind those objects to the forms using like th object and th text and be able to bind a particular getter to that particular field. So the question was, how can I do something similar in JTE? Turns out it's really easy because we can include an object in our page. So in our form page, we can say, hey, this is a user object, and then we can say the value of this field is user.getFirstName, right? So we're going to build a fun little example today that's going to be a little bit more than just a simple example. We're going to walk through and create an example that has a simple form. It's a nice looking form. I'm using Tailwind. I grabbed one of the Tailwind components for a form to get us started. The HTML for that is in the repository, so if you want to follow along, you can. What we're going to do is we're going to have this form, we're going to submit it, and we're going to persist this information into a database. A little bit more complete example. We'll use something like Spring Data JDBC. We'll use a Postgres database. We'll use Docker Compose to spin one up if you don't have one. If you want to simplify this and you don't want to use Docker and Postgres, you can always use an embedded database if you want to. So what we're going to do, I'm going to switch over to here. This is the example that we're going to go through. If you want to grab the code, it's on my GitHub at danvega/JTE forms. There's a bunch of information in here on kind of how to get started with this example, some of the code that we're going to write. But this is the example you can kind of come back to later if you don't want to have to follow along. So to get started, one of the things that's in here, if you look in here, it shows you the dependencies that you need for this. But one thing I love doing is being able to kind of fill out the Spring Initializer and share all of those dependencies. So this link will get you that. So instead of starting from fresh, you can just come in here and use this. So I'm going to rename this to forms because I already have one called JTE forms just for my sake here. But you can see we're using Spring Web. We're using JTE, which is now available on the Spring Initializer. We're using Spring Data JDBC so we can get that repository support so I don't have to write out the CRUD methods for being able to save something to a database. We're going to use the Postgres database, so we're grabbing that driver. We're using the Docker Compose support, which will look at all the dependencies. In this case, it sees that Postgres is there. And what it will do is actually create a compose.yaml file for this. This is what you could run Docker Compose up on, but in the latest versions of Spring Boot, it will automatically recognize this by convention and run Docker Compose up for you so that service is ready when your Spring application starts. Really, really handy feature. I've done some videos on that in the past too if you're interested in that. And then Spring Boot DevTools just kind of gives us those things that we need when we're developing code on our local machine. So with that, I will click generate. I will download a zip file. Once you've done that, you can open this up in whatever text editor or IDE you're most productive in. For me, that's IntelliJ Ultimate Edition, but nothing we're doing here is that special. Although I will take a look at the database inside of IntelliJ. There's some nice database tools, so I can dive in and show you that a record was indeed persisted. But if you're not using that, you can use whatever database tools you're using to connect to a database. So with that, I think we have everything we need to get started. What are we waiting for? Let's write some code. All right, so we're going to get started here. I dropped in this image. This is what the form is going to look like. This is in the final README if you pull the repo down. Pretty basic form, but it has personal information like first name and last name, email, country, street address, city, state, zip. So pretty simple. So we're going to need to model a user object in our system to hold all these fields like first name and last name. You can see first and last are required. In a real form, we'd probably want to make more of these required, but I just want to show off some validation here as well. So to get started, we have an application, nothing going on there. I have this template in here. This contains just the raw HTML if you want to copy this. Again, this is using Tailwind. I've talked about this before. This is a good way to just get something up and running. Not great for production. there are better ways to include Tailwind if you want to use it for production, because this kind of pulls all of Tailwind in and you don't want to ship that to production. So just wanted to get that out of the way. But this is the main HTML that you'll need. And then we'll add in the dynamic bits that kind of connect us to our object, if you will, our user object. So I think the first thing that we should do is create a new Java class called user. Now I am going to use a class here and not a record, because when we instantiate the user object, we want it to be empty. So we're going to say, here's an empty object, include this in the form, bind to this object, and nothing's going to be, no information is going to be in there. Records are immutable, so we can't just say, give me an empty user object. So we'll need to use a class here. We're going to use Spring Data, and I want the table to be called users. So I'll just say users, and then we'll go through and create some fields here. So I want to use along for the ID. We're going to use Spring Data, so we're going to mark it with that ID. And we're going to go ahead and create a string, which is first name, a string for last name. We'll use pretty much a string for everything here, right? Oops, typo, private string, email. Okay, so with those, I'll create an empty args, no args constructor there. I'll create some getters and setters. So let's just say for all of these, and we'll create a toString, and you could probably go ahead and create a equals and hash code as well. So with that, we now have something that represents our user object. So the next thing we'll need is a repository. So let's create a repository. We'll call this user repository. This is going to be an interface, and this will extend the list CRUD repository. And we are doing this on our user, and then the ID type here is long. And so that will give us all of the CRUD operations that we need. So it gives us these, which we can find all, but it also extends a CRUD repository, which includes that save method that we need to go ahead and persist an entity off to the database. So with that in place, we can go ahead and create a controller. So let's say user controller. Again, this is going to be marked with @controller because we are using a template engine here. We are going to use JTE. So we need a get mapping for the root, and this will be our main kind of layout. So we'll say string index. This is going to return index, and that is going to be our main template. One thing that we'll use in there right away is an empty user object. So we'll say model. We are pulling this in from Spring. This is that one. And so we'll need to create a new user object in there. So I'll say model.addAttribute. We'll call this user, and we'll just create a new user object. And again, that's why we're using a class here and not a record. All right, so let's go ahead and copy the HTML from here, and we'll create a new, one of the things IntelliJ tells me to do is create a new JTE root, just so it knows where these are. And then we'll create an index.jte. We'll paste this in, and then we'll kind of add some dynamic behavior to here. So the first thing that we want to do is declare a couple parameters. So we'll say @param, and the first one that we're going to use is the user object. So I'm going to say user, and we'll call this user. Let's create a couple more just so we have them. One will be called message. This will be like a success message, and one might be a error message. We'll deal with those a little bit later. So now that we have this user object, right, we can come down and so we see that this is going to call a method called save once we post this form. So what I want to do is we can leave these in place. What I want to do is come down to all of the inputs and say the value for this is going to be from that user object, and we'll just say user.getFirstName, and that will be it. So we'll say user.lastName, and we'll go email. Oh, I left that one in there. That's okay. This one we'll come back to in a second. That's okay. So we could just say user.getCountry, but what we really want to do is we want to say, like, if that value is equal to the country, then we want to select this. So one way that we can do this is we can say user.getCountry, and by default this is going to be null. So as long as it's not null and user.getCountry is equal to US, then we'll go ahead and set that as selected. So by default, it will just be the select a country. But if we were to save part of the form and like something came back with errors, that user object would get populated with the correct country. And then when we came back to the form, it would be selected. So for street address, we'll do something similar, get street address, right? And city, user.getCity. And then down here, we'll do something similar that we did for country. We'll say user.getRegion. So get region is not equal to null, and user.getRegion is equal to Ohio. And again, we could, you could do this dynamically if you had a bunch of values coming back. So that is that. We have one more, which is user.get postal code, right? Okay. So now we should be able to run this and we should be able to see a blank form and we shouldn't get any errors because we're creating a new user object and that user object is passed down to this template. And then we are just saying something like user.getFirstName, right? And we can even test this out. So let's do something a little different here. Let's say new user.var user, yes, user. Let's pass this in here. And let's just say user.setFirstName equal to Dan, just so we could see that populated and passed down there. So now we should be able to go to our application. Let's go ahead and run this app. And oh, I forgot we have Docker installed. So yeah, we do have a database running. So just to mention that, again, we're using Docker Compose. So it's going to start a database up for us. We're not using the database yet, but it is started up for us. Let me just rename a couple of these. So my SAS, let's say password, and let's call this Dan. And then I want to map 5432 to 5432. This is just because I am going to pull the database up and I need a port to connect to. If I don't do this, it just kind of assigns a random port and I won't know what that is unless I do some inspecting of the container. So this just helps me connect to that database. We don't really care about that right now. All we want to do is see the form in action. So I'm going to launch 8080 and we see the form. We see that name is populated because we've set that in the user object. We have our success message, our error message. We'll come back and fix those later, but we can fill these out. We can click save, and that's going to push us to the save controller action, which we have not defined yet. So we can do that, but let's do a couple other things. We want to get our database set up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a schema.sql. So schema.sql. I'm going to paste in some SQL here. This, again, is in the repository. This is just setting up that users table with all of those fields. From there, we'll also need to add a couple of properties here. So we want to say, I don't know why I like this up front, but we want to say that init mode, so init mode is equal to always, because again, we're not using an embedded database. So we want to make sure that when this starts up, it picks up that SQL and runs it for us so that that table gets created. I want to make sure Docker Compose is enabled, which it is. And you can mess with the lifecycle management. I'll leave it at start and stop. I just kind of wanted to be explicit about what we're doing there. Again, if you don't want to include Docker and Postgres and make this a little more complicated, you can just use something like H2, use an embedded database, and that will kind of keep this a little bit easier to get up and running with. Okay, but with that, now we have a database that we can connect to. So there'll be a users table. So from our user controller standpoint, we want to be able to persist that off, right? So we want to say, let's create a post mapping, and this is going to be to /save. Again, I'm kind of dancing around some things here that are not best practices. I would probably have like some different endpoint here, but that's okay. Let's just walk before we can run. So I also want to get a couple of things in here. I want a logger. So I'm going to get a logger, and I'm also going to inject the user repository. So user repository, call that user repository, and we'll get that through final, and we'll get that through constructor injection. So now I can go ahead and use that here. So we are going to say this is save user. This is going to take in the actually the user object first, and then the model, which is called model, right? So the first thing I can do is I want to just go ahead and save the user off. So I would say user repository dot save, and we would save the user off into the database. Next, what I want to do is just add a attribute. So add an attribute for message, and that message will be user information was saved successfully, right? So now with that in place, we should be able to, again, we're just going to return the index. And now what we should do is once we save this, it persists this off to the database and then gives us this message. So if we wanted to, we can come back to our index.jte here. And what we want to do is just kind of put a condition around this. So we want to say if the message is not equal to null, right, we are going to do this. And then we can change this out to actually display the message, right? So I will come back to like validation and error stuff later, but let's just see if this works. Okay, so I'm going to reload this, and we have a problem. That's okay. Failed to obtain failed password authentication for user Dan. That's okay. So I think what happened was we started this. So let's go ahead and bring up Docker. And I think I had an existing one of these already running. So let's say delete this and delete this. And let's just make sure we're starting fresh here. Okay, let's see if this runs. Okay, so now we have our form here. Again, let's go ahead and back this out. So we don't need any information here. We'll just say new user. I just wanted to kind of show that off. But okay, so now let's fill this in. And let's go ahead and click save. And we got our message was saved successfully. Let's see if it's in the database. So let's create a quick data source to talk to a Postgres database. So we'll say that. I believe, yeah, localhost 5432. The username was Dan. The password was password. And the database was my SAS. Yeah, I think so. Let's see if that works. And there it is. And here's our table. Here's our users table. And voila, we had a record persisted to the database. All right, so we're moving right along. This is looking good. I want to add a couple of things here. So first, let's come back here and let's do something similar here. So at if error is not equal to null, then we'll do this and if, right? And then we'll display an error message. So let's say error, okay. And what we want to do in the user is basically, again, you can make this a little bit more fully featured. All I'm going to do is just check the first name and the last name. So I'm going to say, hey, I want to make sure so we don't have the validation in here. So that's one thing I forgot. Let's go ahead and add that. So the validation starter used to be part of web. It's not anymore. So we need to add that. So we'll say Spring Boot starter validation. We'll bring that in. Let's reload Maven. And now we can come in and say, hey, I want this to not be blank. And the message I want you to display is the first name should not be blank. And then we'll do the same for the last name. Now, I don't think I'm actually using the messages here, but I'm just kind of showing this off. Should not be blank. But yeah, you can obviously take this a little bit further. So now we have some validation constraints on here. Now to use those, I'm going to come back over to save, and I'm basically going to say @valid. Like, I want you to validate this user. Now, problem with this is right away, if we like send a request in that's not valid, it's just going to kind of kick back to the form. So one thing I can do here is I can add an exception handler for method argument not valid exception, right? And I can say if this happens, this is the method I want you to invoke. And we'll say handle validation exceptions. Now, again, there are a couple different ways that you can do this, but this is how I'm going to choose to do it here. So we get the exception, and then we also get the model. And then what we can do with this is basically use that exception and get the binding result, and we can get the target for that. So target, and let's turn this into a var. Now I want to cast this into a user, so I'm going to say user. Oops. Sorry, this is IntelliJ there is screwing me up a little bit. So let's come back here. And I basically want to say this is a user, and we're going to cast this to a user because we know what's coming back as a user object. So once I have that, now I can add a couple of things to the model. So add attribute. And the reason I'm doing this is because, again, there may be some valid values in there, and we want to pre-populate the form with everything that was filled in correctly. We don't want to just send back an empty user. So now I can say model.addAttribute, and this time I'm going to just define an error message that says, please fill out all of the required fields, right? Okay, and then all we're going to do is, actually, let me log this out. So I'll say log.info, user validation failed for, and then we'll just pass the user in. So if we wanted to see what those values were, we could, and then I'll just return the index again. Again, we're just using that same form for everything. So we're going to post to save. It's going to try and save that off, but this @valid is going to kick in and do some validation, and then this will get picked up, and we'll just send it back to the index with a user object that's populated with some info. And it's also going to send back this error message so we know to display an error up here. All right. So again, these are the required fields. This should work. Let's go ahead and see this in action. So I'm going to have to fill in these. United States, 1, 2, 3, blah. And I'm going to go ahead and click save. And it says, please fill out the required fields. Again, first name and last name were left blank, but we preserved all of the things that we did fill in because they were attached to that user object, and we sent that user object back. So now if we fill in the first name and we click save, still we got an error. Actually, let's just fill in some different errors or different information so we can see this saved, and now it was persisted off to the database, and now we can come back to the database and see our 2 records in there. So cool. Yeah, I think that that really was all I wanted to show off, right? I thought that was a lot of fun. So just to kind of recap, we are using Spring Web MVC. We are using JTE as the template engine. Again, I've been doing some videos on JTE, and I think this is a really nice syntax. I enjoy working with it. So we have our template, and because we can kind of declare parameters up here, right? We're declaring a parameter of user. We're not guessing, right? We get that nice IntelliSense too, because we have this user object. And when I say user.get first name, we get that IntelliSense that we can go ahead and use. So we have this object that's passed down, and this is similar to using something like Thymeleaf's th object and th text for pulling or for binding that object to the form. So I thought this was a lot of fun. And again, I made it a little bit more full featured. We have some validation. We're persisting off to a database. I thought this was a lot of fun. So this was one of the questions I got, like, how can I work with forms in Spring Web with JTE? And I hope this example kind of shows that off for you. So friends, you know what the deal is. If you found this useful, do me a big favor, and I know that you will. Because you are really good friends of this channel, and I appreciate your support. If you can, do me a big favor, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, happy coding, friends.